Welcome to my channel, everyone. I've spent the last couple weeks putting together the ultimate guide to learning the ins and outs of Valorant. My goal in today's video is to break apart every single aspect of learning Valorant effectively, understanding core concepts of the game, and effectively improving at the game. This video will be timestamped throughout the entirety of the video and organized for convenient watchability. Please make sure if you have any friends that are new to the game, or you yourself are learning Valorant, that you share this video with your friends to help them in their Valorant improvement journey. Also, I have a second channel where I post variety content, so if you're interested in seeing what else I get up to, feel free to check that out. And I also stream on Twitch. With that out of the way, let's get started.
Backbone of the team!
Wait a minute. What's in the skies? Just
There is a massive difference between tactical FPS games and standard FPS games. TAC FPSs, simply put, are the inclusion of large amounts of team coordination, tactics, and mechanical skill. This separates tactical FPS titles from the standard FPS game that relies simply on shooting your opponent. This also means that there's a much higher skill floor and barrier to entry to these games. This is where I come in. I'm going to break every facet down and dive as deep as possible into each, while trying to keep this guide as digestible as possible. Valorant is a unique tactical FPS. It borrows concepts from games like Overwatch and CS2. It borrows the way the rounds are played out from CS2, and a little bit of the gunplay. It also takes a bit of inspiration from Overwatch's flashy abilities and combos. Valorant's abilities are simple, so I won't delve too deep into them, but just know that abilities, simply put, are just pieces of utility that are unique to the character you are playing. Utility, to an extent, will determine how you play the game, so picking a main is important, but not so important that you need to stress out about it. Every character has a specific role they fill in the game. This doesn't mean there is no fluidity between the roles, but means that they excel at certain aspects of gameplay. Just because you pick one role doesn't mean you are locked into that playstyle. There are 4 roles in Valorant, and multiple subsets in each: Duelist, Controller, Initiator, and Sentinel. Duelists, simply put, are the ones that excel at taking fights, and their utility is made to assist them in either winning fights or getting out of subpar fights. Duelists will generally take the role of an entry fragger, which we'll talk about a bit more in depth later. Duelist utility is meant to help them secure kills and also to help their team push onto site. This doesn't mean that the duelist should always have the most kills. There is a good chance you'll only be securing 1 kill a round, which by all means is easily more than enough. So don't feel bad if you main duelist and can't secure kills frequently. Always focus on improvement over current performance. The 2 main types of duelist are the flashing and the mobility duelist. Before we talk about flashing duelist though, let's talk a little bit about the uses and implications of having a flash. Flashes essentially are a piece of utility that will completely blind the enemy team, making it so they cannot see their screen. This is good for dealing with players holding angles, as you can throw a flash to either force them off of the angle or to push them while they are blinded. The main point of including flashbangs on a duelist is simply to enable said character to flash for themselves to get kills, rather than rely on their teammates' flashes. Duelists' flashes generally come out quicker than other characters' flashes, and they can recover quickly from throwing them to allow quick follow-up. Mobility duelists are the characters that are able to navigate throughout the map quickly. They can also move quickly across the enemy screen, making them a harder target to hit. These characters are also amazing at getting themselves out of sticky situations using their escapability utility. This enables characters such as Jett or Reyna to take a very dangerous fight and get out completely free. Next on our list is controllers. Controllers excel at blocking sightlines, delaying, and general map control. Generally, every controller has some way to block sightlines. This role is hands down the most essential in any team composition. Smokes and sightline blockage are important for running down the time in a round. It is also important for shutting down a push or for taking sights against the enemy team. Most controllers come with some sort of gimmick. Take Omen, for example. He has mobility utility in the form of his TP and also comes with a flash. Brimstone has a molly to help with his delay power, and he also has the longest smokes in the game, lasting a massive 19.25 seconds. All the controllers have some weird gimmick that separates them from each other, and every controller has a place to an extent, as well as a map that they pair well with. Initiators are also very important. They provide information, flashes, sometimes both, depending on the character, and they are simply the role that initiates fights. I mean, who would have known? It's in the name, right? They can gather information, they can flash your team onto sight, and they can stun enemies stuck in certain angles. Every initiator has an ultimate that can heavily assist in a sight take, or, on the flip side, a sight retake, which we'll dive into a bit later. Initiators are honestly one of the most fun roles in my opinion, and they're extremely versatile and aren't as role locked as other characters.
Careful now. Found you. Okay, time for a break.
Sentinels. Sentinels are easily the most annoying character to play against in Valorant, and unfortunately have the most lame playstyle. If you play a Sentinel, please, for the love of God, grow up. But if you're curious about playing Sentinel, here's what you need to know. Sentinel's main role is locking down the site they are playing and assisting in map control for defense. Some Sentinels also come with a tripwire of sorts. This can be used to cover areas of the map that your team doesn't want to dedicate players to watch. All right, that's it. That's all. Sentinels, yeah, super fun gameplay, super enjoyable and interactive. If you play Sentinel, you're a loser. Moving on. Picking a main is important, as it's the character you'll generally prefer to play. But it's not as important as you may think. It'll determine how you play to an extent, but every character, thankfully, has some form of fluidity that allows them to pick up different playstyles. Your main should honestly be what you find the most fun at first. Pick whatever character you think just looks really cool, whatever you vibe with. You can easily switch mains at any point in your Valorant journey. Just because you pick one character to main doesn't cement you to stick with them or their playstyle. It's also smart to try and understand every role at least to a decent level and to play every role at least a few times. There is importance of knowing every single role and how to play them, as it opens up a lot of understanding about the game in general. If you played Sova a decent bit, you'll have a decent idea of how their Sova will be using their utility and how they may play around out. This applies to every agent in the game. It's also important because if your character is taken or you need a specific role filled, you're capable of playing said role. So pick a character that you find the most fun, and from there, you can determine if it suits your playstyle. With enough time, you'll understand your playstyle and you'll understand which role you fit best. Team composition is essential, at least having a grasp on it is. I'm a firm believer that with the right team in ranked, team composition doesn't really matter as much. You can win with 5 duelists, you'll just have a much harder time. The standard team composition is going to look something like this. One Sentinel to lock down one side of the map. This allows the rest of the Sentinel's team to move more freely around the map, as their utility is pretty good at covering one side. 1 to 2 duelists. Mobility duelists are generally stronger for one duelist, as it allows them to get onto site in a quicker fashion, allowing for fast plays. This also means that they're a lot better at taking space than standard flashing duelists. If there is a second duelist, it doesn't matter what they play, as they all have their perks, but usually you're going to want like one mobility duelist at least. An initiator is usually crucial, just solely for the fact of forcing players off of common angles and clearing out tight angles, or just getting intel on if the enemy is in a specific area or not. Controllers, like I was saying earlier, are usually the most important role that should be picked. Without vision blocking, taking a sight from the enemy team and delaying the enemy team from pushing onto your site becomes infinitely harder. And like I said, team composition matters to an extent. In ranked specifically, your team composition doesn't have to be extremely rigid, but you should still consider all the roles and their purposes while you pick your character. Every character is good at certain maps, except for, maybe Deadlock and Chamber. Consider the utility you're presented with, and then consider the map you are playing before you pick your character for the match. Raze is not great on Breeze due to the wide open corridors. She's great at shutting down enemies trying to push through small corridors due to her nade and boombot. Alternatively, Raze is great on Split, as she can control certain areas of the map with ease through the use of her utility. Viper is not great on Haven, Since once her utility is placed down, most of it cannot be retrieved. This makes it difficult for her to be useful around the map, unlike Omen and Brimstone, who can smoke any area at any time if they're in the right position. Phoenix isn't great at maps like Breeze, as his flashes aren't as effective in open spaces on the map. So consider your utility, how it functions, and what maps will be your best friend. Every character has a signature ability. This ability will never have to be purchased and will come back in the round based on either a timer or on 2 kills. Every character has a fairly unique signature, so just keep this in mind. Flashes are one of the most important pieces of utility. They offer a slight window once you throw them that allow you to gain advantage on the angle. If you know an enemy is on an angle, you can flash to force them off and follow this up by posting onto that angle. This is known as creating a line. They can also assist you in securing kills or moving to new positions. Detains are less common as they really only come from ultimate abilities. A detain will slow you and make it so you cannot fight for a while. This only happens from Killjoy Ultimate and Gecko Ultimate respectively. Suppress stops you from using abilities. Very simple. Intel Gathering utility is good for clearing angles or seeing if there are enemies present at any given location. These types of utility look something like KO Knife, Sova Dart, or Fade Eye. These abilities are super helpful when trying to take sight, retake sight, or determine if enemies are around your area. Droning utility comes in the form of Sova Drone, Sky Dog, Fade Dog, etc. Some droning utility offers vision, whereas some does not. Droning utility is also very good for clearing out areas or for taking sight and gathering information for the duelist to capitalize on. Reveals are simply pieces of utility that reveal an outline of an enemy through walls. These come in the form of Sova Dart, Fade Eye, Cypher Ult, and Cypher Trips. If you have a well-placed reveal and are sitting behind smokes or walls, you're able to capitalize very easily by shooting through said smoke or walls. This is usually most common on Ascent with Sova, since you're able to shoot through a large chunk of walls on that map. It's also pretty common that you'll see a Cypher sitting in like A Heaven and playing off of what everyone usually just calls a kill trip, where he is just playing off of the reveal. Stuns are debatably not that great. Once hit by a stun, you will only be able to fire 1 bullet at a time. Your screen will blur and darken and shake. On top of that, movement speed will be decreased. Breach Stun, Sky Dog, Astra Stars, etc. There's a lot of different stuns in the game, and thankfully, to some extent, you're able to fight back. Note that if you are using a scoped weapon, you will not be able to scope in if you are stunned. Vulnerable is a debuff that when applied causes you or the enemy to take double damage from any source. Viper, Killjoy, ISO, and a few others have the ability to apply this debuff, and it can make for some pretty free kills. ISO, arguably, has the best vulnerable, as he's able to throw it and fight instantly. Near sights are similar to flashes. They make it so the enemy can only see a few feet in front of them. If you're hit by Fade's Dog or hit by Omen's Blind, you'll be nearsighted. You can counter nearsights if you are in a tight corridor by holding close to where the enemy will peek. Trips are fairly annoying pieces of utility. There's Cypher Trips and Informational Trips. Cypher Trips are the most annoying easily, as they reveal and stun, and at the end of the timer, they reset if not broken, which is by far one of the stupidest buffs I think I have ever seen a character receive. Anyways, Informational Trips are primarily used to hold flank, so you don't need to dedicate a teammate to cover it. Cypher Trips can also be used alternatively as information instead of using them lethally as kill trips. Mollies, aside from smokes, are the #1 piece of stalling utility. They're also good at flushing and damaging. They can delay enemy players from pushing into areas, stop diffuses, and flush opponents out of corners they may be playing in, forcing them to take a fight against you. One of the biggest applications of mollies in Valorant is post-plant lineups. For example, here on Haven, if you shoot a molly at a specific area, it will land on the default plant position. This will allow you to be in a very safe angle and delay through the use of your molly. We've talked about smokes a lot. Just know they're mainly there to block off sight lines and to delay. You can play inside of them with shotguns, just be aware if they're about to fade, you're going to want to get out of it. Walls are similar to smokes. They cover a linear path rather than a bubble. Some of them also function a little differently than smoke. Viper Wall is interesting because it acts on a timer that will drop when she runs out of toxins. It also applies decay to anyone that touches it. Astra Wall is bulletproof, similar to ISO's push wall, and a few characters have walls. Phoenix Wall is the only wall that can be manipulated and curved other than Harbor. Barriers are similar to walls, but they act as a piece of utility that cannot be passed through, such as Sage Wall or Deadlock's Wall. Barriers all function slightly differently, so make sure you're paying attention and understanding how they all work. Escapability utility It's amazing and a bit unfair, to be honest. These pieces of util range from a jet dash to a Reyna dismiss to even an omen TP. Anything that can get you safely away from action can realistically be classed as escapability, but we'll talk about the common ones here. Jet dash is the prime example of strong escape utility. It allows you to instantly dash in any one direction. This means if you're in a poor position, you're able to dash out of danger after taking a fight. This also means that you're able to take one fight, and if you feel you're about to lose or you win the fight and another enemy peeks you, you're able to escape for free. This utility is super strong because it allows you to play in areas that are generally unsafe and turn it into a safe position. This also means it can help you take the enemy off guard since unsafe angles are more uncommonly played. Healing utility is simple. It allows you to heal your teammates up, excluding shields. Sage heal can function as a self heal, and so can Phoenix's molly and wall. Sky's heal is great for healing multiple teammates, and that's pretty much it. Ultimate abilities are one of the most important abilities in the game. Every ultimate in the game is unique to that agent, and every ultimate has a point value assigned to be able to use it. You get ult orbs for kills, deaths, planting, defusing, and grabbing orbs. This means that farming ultimates is a safe strategy if you're playing against the right character. Just note that no matter what, an ultimate is worth being used if it helps you secure a round you otherwise would have lost. So please, don't be afraid to use an ultimate. As long as you think it is needed or feel as though you'd lose the round without it, just use it. Valorant is broken up into rounds. First to 13 round wins the game. At 12 rounds in, there is a side swap. Also, if both teams end at 12-12, the game goes into overtime, where both teams will get a shot on attacker and defender. It's a 2-round overtime, where you need to win on both attack and defense. If you don't win both rounds, you vote for another overtime. The attacker's goal is to eliminate the other team or plant the spike and let it blow up. The defending side's goal is to eliminate the other team and prevent them from planting the spike. Each round lasts a maximum of 100 seconds if the spike isn't put down. Planting the spike increases the duration by 45 seconds. If the time runs out, spike is not down, and players from both sides are alive, defender's side wins by default. Now, map control. It's very simple, so let's dive into it real quick. Both sides will generally fight for areas of the map. Gaining space in areas pressures the opposing team. Whoever has more map control has more options in any given round. Neutral zones are areas of the map that either defense or attack starts with, but can be given up if there's too much pressure. A good example is Garage. Defense will always start with control of this area, and it's important that they hold control over it. But if the defense team is getting fought too hard, it's sometimes worth to give it up in favor of not losing too many players fighting. We're going to use Haven for most of our examples on map control, as it's a map where players generally fight over a few areas to take space, or they'll end up giving up the space. Haven is also a map where teams suffer the most from lack of map control. Defense generally starts with a few areas covered that are classed as neutral zones. Let's show off Garage and the importance of controlling it. Garage, simply put, is important to control as it allows them to fight out of it and also makes it so the C player doesn't have to worry about that area as much. From Garage, you're capable of fighting for C site and alternatively, fighting grass with your teammates that may be fighting middle. Losing control of this or even losing a player here can be super devastating. So, if the defense loses a player inside of Garage, not only do they lose this fighting power, but now they have to dedicate a player towards watching the exit of Garage. This also means that the player on C site is pressured even more, not only from C long, but Garage as well. If need be, you can give this zone up, but losing a player here can be a big no-no. For attackers, map control on the flip side is also very important. Let's take a look at what happens when you decide to dedicate 5 players towards a C hit. So, for example, this site take doesn't work. Now, your team has 2 options, reset or rehit. If your team chooses to reset, they now have to deal with the possibility that the defender team has gained all of this map control in other areas. This is why it's important to hold on to map control. Let's move on, but we'll touch on map control a bit deeper later. Back to the basics for now. Orb farming is important for both teams, so it's smart to make some effort to do it. There's a few ways to accomplish this for both sides. On Bind, fighting for showers on either team can result in an orb. Doing this every single round can snowball you towards having your ultimate every few rounds. This can heavily affect the outcome of a match. Alternatively, fighting for long is a way to farm this orb for either team. A well-placed smoke and some spam usually results in you getting this orb freely. Alright, economy. So here's how you get credits. Credits are used to buy utility and weapons. You get 200 credits per kill, 300 for planting the spike, and 3,000 credits for a round win. For losing rounds, you also get credits, and thankfully, there is a loss bonus, so you get more credits the more rounds you lose in a row. This will help the losing team hopefully get some momentum back. 1 round lost is 1,900 credits. 2 rounds lost is 2,400, followed by 2,900 credits at the maximum. You can also see the minimum if you hover over your buy menu here. The importance of managing economy and the simplicity behind it is making sure your buys are lined up with the rest of your team. The pistol round is a decider of how you'll play these rounds out and when you'll be doing each of these types of rounds. So, first off, we have the buy round. Buy rounds, simply put, are rounds that you and your team can afford almost all of your equipment and a rifle. Usually you'll land somewhere around 4,300 to 4,700 credits on the high end to be able to afford everything including a Vandal or Phantom. Know that you can use light shields as Vandal can already kill with 1 headshot. Just know it's almost always better to upgrade, but you can rock their light shields in a lot of scenarios. Buy rounds are the most important of these rounds and are what you should aim to have consistently. Half buy rounds are rounds that your team is a bit lacking in money, but still want to buy a few things. On half buy rounds, you and your team will usually just buy enough items in order to be able to afford a full buy round next round, but have decent enough resources to hopefully win the round. Bonus rounds are simply there to help you build your economy. Generally, if you win the first round, you'll be max buying SMGs or Vandals with the exception of players saving for the operator. This means if you then win the second round, it's sometimes smart to bonus round and build even more money by just using the weapons you already have. This can in turn snowball your economy and help you have a lot of extra money, especially if you end up winning the round. So, if everyone on your team dies on second round, sometimes it'll be smart to go into an eco round. On eco rounds and save rounds, it's smart to use ultimates like Jet Knives or Chamber Operator to help you have a better arsenal. This is where your team has a little bit of money, around 3,000 credits. You can still afford maybe a Sheriff, which costs 800, or you can afford some utility and other small items. You need to do these rounds when you're really lacking in funds in order to be able to do a full buy with your team and get your economy back on track. Eco rounds are generally won with a plan. You'll lose eco rounds usually if you don't have some sort of plan in place. This plan can look like stacking a site, rushing the area as a team, or it can look like slow plays with a lot of emphasis on fighting one player with a small group of like 3 players or something. On defense, stacking a site has a decent success rate, as well as fighting for an area with a group of 3 to 5 players. You can also play ratty corners, which just means playing close angles with shotguns or setting up crossfires in areas that attackers tend to traverse through often. On attack, spreading out and playing for picks is generally a great way to get some extra guns and free kills. Taking a further step down, we have a save round. A save round is a round where you pretty much buy nothing because you're straight up impoverished. You generally will lose these rounds, but by having some sort of plan in place, you can increase your success rate greatly. Also note that using ultimates on save rounds and eco rounds is generally a no-go, but if you see it winning you the round, go for it. I'm a Phoenix player, and there's a lot of instances I'll use my ultimate simply to grab a gun an enemy may have dropped, and it's won me quite a few rounds. So moving on to force buy rounds, these are rounds you can't afford a full buy or a half buy, but your team, for whatever reason, wants to buy whatever they can. Generally, players after losing second round after winning the first will force back and attempt to gain their momentum back from the enemy team. This generally isn't a great idea. It's just a high risk, high reward type of round. Sometimes though, you do have to force if it's last round in half or if your team is down 8-11 and don't want to play for overtime. There are a few instances where you will be force buying and it's not always bad, so just know that. Hero buys are simply just one person buying while everyone else saves. Usually you'll see this if a player on your team has a weapon ultimate next round or they have a way to ensure they'll have it next round. For instance, if Jet is 3 orbs off of knives, they can buy a rifle, farm an orb, and even if they die, they can grab orb next round and have knives. This is generally almost always a good idea, as it gives you a slight upper hand, and if you don't shoot your weapon, sometimes the enemy will get greedy, assuming your team is saved, and might give you a free pick as they don't expect one random player with a Vandal. Light versus heavy shields is a big debate in Valorant. Just know, light shield performs great against enemies with Vandals, whereas heavy shields are almost essential while going against players on half buy or eco rounds. The reasoning behind this is enemies on eco have fast fire rate weapons that deal a lot of chip damage. You'll need the 25 extra armor in a lot of instances to absorb more damage. Speaking of going against eco rounds, it's important that you know how to effectively counter these types of rounds. These are known as anti-eco rounds. rounds where you are going against an eco with your full buy. On the outside, it may seem like a free round, but play it incorrectly and you can see the enemy team stealing the round win from you pretty easily. On defense, if the enemy team is ecoing, make sure you are not giving them any opportunity to give free kills. This means do not peek angles that you don't have to, and do not push unnecessarily. Giving them a free kill could give them a weapon that they could in turn use to win the round. On attack, it's important to play together as a team if you realize the enemy team is ecoed. This can be done by pressing tab and seeing their money. If they're ecoed, they're usually around 2,000 to 2,500 credits. If they are ecoed, play together and hit a site as a team. If the defending team decides to push an area, do not challenge them. Fall off of the area they are pushing and go to a site as a team. I know it's enticing to get free eco frags, but challenging a team of 4 sheriffs and jet knives is very dangerous. Just go to site as they generally won't have anyone, or maybe they'll just have one dude with a sheriff, right? So eco rounds may look unassuming from your perspective, but it is very easy to lose an anti-eco round. So take your time, figure out what the enemy team is doing, and play the round reactively. If you are unsure of eco team's intentions at the start of the round, poke and prod at areas and use your intel utility to figure it out. A well-placed KO knife can reveal 3 to 5 players stacking a site. A Sova drone can reveal a few players sitting in close angles waiting for you to walk into a trap. And waiting a few seconds outside of areas at the start of the round can counter the enemy team trying to rush into your unsuspecting team, where you can then decide to leave and hit a site away from their push. So, getting into the weapons, the Vandal is the weapon you'll see the most in Valorant. Costing a simple 2,900 credits, the Vandal is usually a one-hit headshot at most ranges. Its magazine holds 25 ammo and has 50 in reserves. The weapon is the precision rifle, where you'll see players at the highest level tapping and bursting mainly as opposed to spraying. The weapon is a high performer at range and is generally bought on full buy and half buy rounds. Also coming in at 2,900 credits, the Phantom. It does not one-hit headshot at range. What the Phantom lacks in damage, it makes up for in magazine size, reserve ammo, and spraying potential. It holds 30 in one mag and 60 in reserves. The Phantom does one-hit headshot up close, thankfully, and it's also important to note that you cannot see tracers from this weapon as it's suppressed, meaning you can spam more effectively through smokes. The weapon is touted to be the better of the two, but usually you'll buy either the Vandal or the Phantom depending on the map. The Vandal is better at long range. The Phantom is better in tight corridors and for fighting multiple opponents, as it enables you to spray more reliably. A good example of maps the Vandal excels on would be Breeze, Bind, and Icebox. An example of maps that the Phantom excels on are Haven, Split, and Sunset. Moving on, we have the Guardian, which is a semi-automatic cannon. Costing a solid 2,250 credits, it's a great choice for half buys. You can shoot 5.25 rounds a second, but it's generally used to methodically tap people at range. You'll usually see people buying this if they cannot afford a Vandal or Phantom, but still want to reliably put players down. The Bulldog is a rifle with a burst fire that activates when holding down right click. It costs 2,050 credits, and it is alternatively bought to the Guardian on your half buys when you can't afford to full buy with your team. Moving on to our snipers, we have the Marshal, which is an anti-eco machine costing only 950 credits. It has nearly perfect no-scope accuracy and has a 90% move speed, so you can quickly navigate and pick off players when they're saving. You can use this weapon on your second round to easily land some free kills, or alternatively, use it any round if you're capable of landing headshots frequently. The Operator is one of the most important weapons in Valorant. This weapon is essential for saying no to the enemy team peeking angles. Posting with an Operator on angles usually results in a lot of free kills. Having at least one of these during your full buys is not essential, but it can help a lot. We'll talk more on its application and how to counter it later. The Ares is a fast-firing eco weapon costing 1,600 credits with a high penetration capability that allows you to spam through walls very effectively. You'll see this paired with revealing utility to spam walls or smokes, and is usually used when you or enemy players cannot afford an Odin and want to accomplish high spam potential. Wall-bangable areas are the Ares' best friend, and with a box of 50 rounds and 100 rounds in reserve, you'll be spamming away non-stop if you decide to buy this weapon. The Odin is the Ares' big brother, also touting a very high penetration potential. This weapon is the best tool for agents that have a lot of revealing mechanics. It touts a huge 100 rounds in its box and 200 in reserves. You'll see this most often on Ascent, with the Sova wielding it for free kills through spammable walls. This weapon costs a massive 3,200 credits, so you usually won't be seeing it outside of full buys. Moving on to our shotguns, we have the Bucky. The Bucky is a fairly strong shotgun for eco rounds that costs 850. It also has an alternate fire that would delay the pellet spread, enabling you to shoot more reliably at range. The Bucky is great in tight corridors and for shouldering and getting a shot or two off before falling off the angle. The Judge is an insanely powerful weapon that can delete enemies up close. It's a semi-automatic shotgun with 5 shots. It costs 1850 and rightfully so. This weapon can deny close corridors completely to enemies and can result in multiple kills if the enemy charges in recklessly. Moving on, we have our SMGs. The Stinger is a great choice for your eco rounds, but it is highly inaccurate. Thankfully though, it has an insanely fast fire rate of 16 rounds a second, and it's best paired with vulnerable abilities. It has 20 rounds in its magazine with 60 in reserves. It also only costs 1100 credits. It's also great played at close angles where you're able to take a fight using a single magazine and running away to take yet another fight. The Spectre is a step up from the Stinger and is also great for running and gunning, but it's also good at medium range duels. Costing a small 1600 credits, the Spectre will definitely give you a decent bang for your buck, and it's a great choice for anti-eco rounds where you have to fight against a wide array of pistols. So moving on to pistols, we have the Classic, which is a free gun, by the way, that has the capability of winning very easily against a Vandal by using its alternate fire that shoots a burst of 3 bullets. You will always start with this weapon, and it has 12 rounds in its mag with 36 in reserve. Playing close angles or jumping over boxes and right-clicking is a great strategy with this weapon. You can use it for long-range duels or even close-up duels to take advantage of its right-clicking power. It's a pretty dumb weapon, so make sure you learn how to use it so you can take advantage of it effectively. The Ghost is good for accurately tapping at mid-range and is a good choice for pistol rounds if you have to fight at range at any point in the round. It costs 500 credits and has a suppressor allowing you to shoot through smokes, and it isn't as indicating of your position as other choices tend to be. It is my personal favorite for pistol rounds as it's easily the most satisfying of the pistols to get kills with. Moving on, we have the most iconic of the pistols. We have the Sheriff, a one-shot cannon that can insta-kill at the right ranges and right accuracy. Costing 800 credits, you'll see this most often on eco rounds or on pistol rounds from characters that don't rely too much on utility. This weapon is amazing at holding angles and waiting for the opponent to swing into you, netting you a free Vandal in a lot of instances. This weapon is what you'll see the majority of players buying on their eco rounds as it's a skill-reliant hand cannon. The Frenzy is a fully automatic pistol with a 13-round magazine that fires at 10 rounds a second and costs 450 credits. It's a pretty solid choice with characters like Reyna, who can lock down specific areas and get free kills and a heal off, and then proceed to create chaos in said area. It's best at short range, as it gets highly inaccurate at longer ranges. Next up, we have the Shorty, which is a good choice of secondary if you plan on taking any short range duels at any point in the round, or you're a character with high movement capability. Costing 3,000 credits, the Shorty shoots a burst of 15 pellets. It also has a horrendous damage drop-off, so make sure you're not buying this if you plan on only using the Shorty for the round and have a good chance of taking a long-range duel. A good tip is if you plan on buying it in any round, is to drop the Shorty on the ground and hold your Classic until the round starts. The Shorty won't despawn like the Classic will, and now, if you have to move somewhere to take a long-range duel, you still have the Classic. Being a shotgun, the Shorty has the highest potential inside of Viper Ultimate, sitting inside of smokes, sitting in tight corridors, or as a secondary to an operator. Next up, we have our character-specific weapons that Jet and Chamber have. The Bladestorm is Jet's ultimate ability, costing 8 ultimate points. It's also known as Jet Knives, and they're an amazing tool to help secure eco rounds or to buy with your team if you can't afford a rifle. It has 5 knives, which reset on kill, and right-click to expel all knives, resulting in losing them. It does 50 damage per knife and is an insta-kill to the head. They are fully accurate while jumping, running, or gliding through the air. The Headhunter is Chamber's personal take on the Sheriff. Costing 150 per bullet with 8 bullets total, the Headhunter is a fast equipping Sheriff that can enable Chamber to always have a powerful secondary weapon. You are able to ADS using the Headhunter, which enables longer range duels, and it also insta-kill headshots at any range. It's 3 bullets to kill anywhere else other than the head. The Tour de Force is Chamber's take on the Operator. You'll see this on rounds where Chamber drops his teammates and opts to use this instead, or on eco rounds, etc. It costs 8 ult points and creates a slow field wherever the player killed by the weapon dies. The Makeshift Operator only has 5 bullets total, and it has an equip time of 0.66 seconds and does 150 damage respectively. It has a fire rate of 0.7 seconds and can shoot once every 1.4 seconds. The slow field expands 6 meters and lasts for 4 seconds, allowing quick follow-up with a flash and another peek from chamber. We're going to talk about a standard setup on defense side, so let's take Haven here for example, as it's pretty standard and pretty easy to explain. Your standard setup will look something like this. One player C site, one player inside of garage, one player spotting C link, and 2 players towards A site. This can obviously be adjusted depending on what side you're struggling more with. Let's break down why these positions are played. C site and garage work together to hold that side of the map. The C link player can be a fast rotator towards garage or C if there's lots of pressure, and one of the A players can also move from A site to cover A link while the C link player leaves. The remaining A player can anchor, which means they don't leave the site or they sit outside of it and play off sound and information. If you take a look at the overarching way this is played, you can see how fluid the defense side really is. On Haven, every defending player has a role to fill. When one defender dies, let's say garage for example, players have to adjust to fill in the gaps that the garage player leaves behind and adjust accordingly. Every defense player is a pawn that can watch a certain angle and maintain control of a certain area. When control of an area is lost, players have to scramble in order to fill the gaps, changing the standard setup. Using utility to help your team gain fluidity around the map is also essential. Tripwires can be placed on B site to watch so players don't have to dedicate towards it. It's also important to note that if the enemy team catches onto this, you'll need to dedicate a player to watching it as opposed to just the tripwire. But if you have the trip watching it, you can move your standard setup to look like this. One garage window, one garage link, and one on C site with 2 players playing towards A. This means you'll have a lot more power in garage, and this setup is generally used if C site and garage is getting heavily abused. This also means that players can move more freely from A to C and vice versa. Just know that you'll need to be able to effectively retake the B site. Retaking B site is quite easy, as it's hard for the attackers to maintain once they've gained control of it. Let's hop over to Bind and talk about our concept of weak and strong side defense so you guys can get a grasp on that. On Bind, your standard setup will look something like this: 2 on A and 3 on B, or alternatively 3 on A and 2 on B. Whatever side has less players is dubbed the weak side. The weak side must control a link, be it long on B site or showers on A site. Reason being is it's very hard for 2 players to shut down a push onto the site itself. Therefore, controlling either of these extremities accomplishes one major factor: more map control over the attackers. This means that even if you lose the site, retaking is a much easier goal to accomplish. This is due to holding control of an avenue, closing in the amount of control the attackers actually have when they have the spike down. This means you can collapse on the enemy team when your team rotates over to accomplish a retake. This is the importance of weak side controlling an extremity. Now you can play defense in a bit more standard form, but this is a great way to play it if the standard form is not working. Here's how to accomplish weak side extremity control. Let's take a look at showers, and we'll take 0 assistance first. 0 assistance is just the 2 players fighting showers, dropping a smoke in, and immediately having control of that area. The enemy team now has to use utility to flush you out of this area. Use your mollies to prevent this from happening, and if they gain space, use flashes and other utility to force them back and hopefully dispatch of the attackers that have gained showers control. Now, if we look at assisted control, we can have Sky throwing flashes through the teleporter as a basic example, and Sky can use flashes to flash for the players in showers and use Dog to help you fight for the extremity very effectively. If you've effectively held this extremity, you can now have Sky TP through if the attackers have planted Spike. This means you'll have 1 to 2 player showers, 1 going up short, and 2 from CT boxing in the attackers and making for an almost impossible post plant. Sure, you may be allowing the team to get the Spike down, but in the long run, you're winning. Let's hop over to Ascent, and let's take a look at how you can use utility to secure your kills. Playing off of utility is an important concept to understand. We'll use a Sova Dart for our first example. Let's take the example that the enemy team is running out B main to execute. If you have a well-placed Sova recon, your teammates sitting behind the smoke in CT are enabled to spam through that smoke for kills. If you're playing Sova, after shooting your dart, you're able to easily fight that as well, as the enemies will be trying to find the dart. This accomplishes a lot. It takes attention away from you and to the dart. It also allows your team to fight with you through smokes, and it distracts the enemy so you hopefully are able to get easier kills. Now, let's talk about playing off trips, as you can accomplish the same thing with well-placed Cypher tripwires, also known as kill trips. If a Cypher asks you to play off trips, this is generally what they mean. They have trips that are placed in areas that enemies won't expect, and when they walk over them, they get revealed to the whole team. Also, let's say you have an alarm bot or tripwire in Garage on Haven. If you hear it go off, you can throw a flash into Garage and secure any kills. This means you can effectively sit outside the Garage and flash when you hear the tripwire get shot or activated. Speaking of flashing, let's talk about flash zones. An example I use often, and I go into depth heavily on in my Phoenix guide, is showers on A-site bind. I'm going to link the in-depth guide here and in the description and pinned comment below. A flash zone, simply put, is an open area that once you throw a flash into, the enemy has limited options to run away or to play anti-flash. Showers is a great example of this, as once you flash into this area, they either have to back out of showers through a tight corridor or meet their fate. Another good example is Tree on Lotus, as once flashed, the enemies have zero escape route. Abusing these flash zones is essential for defense side and attacker side, as it's one of the easiest ways to get kills. You can also manipulate these flash zones and create a new flash zone in general. If the enemy team is gaining on you in showers and you need to leave, you can flash back into showers. But pause. What's the issue here? The enemy team can easily back behind this wall. What you can do with this is create a flash zone for you and your team. You can throw a molly here, for example, and leave showers. This will create a new flash zone by flushing the players to either side of the molly. Once you flash back into showers, they have to either eat the molly or eat the flash. If they are not there, you can use the remaining time on your molly to run back up and flash around the corner, retaking that space from the enemy team effectively. Like I said, I have a super in-depth guide that will be linked, so check that out if you're interested. Information gathering is essential at the start of any round, and we'll use Ascent as a good example. Let's say you have a KO. Knifing outside of A main or B main at the start of a round gives you good information on what they may be doing. Be wary, they could wait this utility out, so it's always good to stagger the timings of it. Just know that using this information is essential in determining how you will adjust your team's positioning throughout the round. Heavy presence outside of B main? Move a player towards B. Have presence outside of A site, but you throw a knife B and catch a player? Keep everyone where they're at, as the attackers are spread out and looking for picks. You can use this informational utility to get forward positioning on the opponents, boxing in the attackers and forcing their hand. Forward positioning is a positioning deep into the zones that attackers usually control. You can position here once you've used information utility to ensure that there are no players in these positions. On Haven, for example, this is insanely strong. If you have a player pushed up into A main, they can use that position for sound to determine where the enemies are at. This also means that since there are no players A, you can dedicate all 4 of your teammates to watching other areas. The power of forward positioning is strong, but it can be risky if the attackers come back your way and end up re-clearing you, so it's good to have some sort of escape plan. I will say, at any rank below Diamond, you'll have quite a low chance of getting re-cleared in these angles. But if they don't re-clear you, this will allow for good trigger discipline plays. Forward positioning is also good for enabling flanks. If the enemy team is hitting a site and you're in a good forward position, it'd be wise to try and get a flank off as you're already pretty deep into their lines. If you end up getting caught by a trip, you can either rejoin your team or continue your path. Aggressive plays are great on defense side for a change of pace. This is usually good when you're just getting steamrolled and you really need to switch something up, or if you're doing well and you want to take the attackers off guard. Aggressive plays are used to gain ground on the attackers in zones that they usually control and hopefully rack up a few kills. On Haven, for example, a fairly common aggressive play is to take mid. It'll look something like this: a smoke into garage window or a molly, 2 players pushing down mid, and once the players are down mid, the garage player flashes out and they fight window and grass as a unit. Once control is gained, your team is presented with 2 options: leave with the picks gained or maintain this forward positioning. If you have man advantage, leave and reset. If you do not have man advantage, it may be better to hold this position and have some semblance of map advantage. Use discretion here though. Speaking of man advantage, it's simply having more players than the enemy team. On defense, it is essential that once man advantage is gained, you do not give them free kills. Balancing the man advantage is attackers' main goal once they have lost it. It's important to note that man advantage is usually more important for defenders than attackers. Attackers are capable of moving as a unit, but when defense side loses players, they have to adjust accordingly and will gain holes in their defense. The more players defense loses, the harder it is for them to cover the map. The attackers, once they lose a player, still have a cohesive unit, but they will search for balancing the scales anyways if they have time, so do not let them. So when you hear someone say, play man advantage, it's a good idea to listen and to not give them free picks. Stacking sites are done when you're running low on options or when you're on an eco or save round. This just means that you have 5 players stacked in one site or one area of the map to hopefully fight against the attackers. This can be smart if the attackers are hitting the same site over and over again and are doing so really recklessly. Just know, if the attackers gain information that you are stacking, they may leave and go to the empty site, so try your best to not give them information for free. Have one player deal with informational utility while the rest of your team stays tucked. A mini stack is dedicating more players towards one area. This is usually seen on full buys. It's usually to counter teams that are abusing areas like C-Site or Garage and getting away with it consistently. Placing an extra player can help fight for that area or deter them away from the area in general. Next, let's talk about rotations, as it's something that's going to happen every single game no matter what. It's important to know when to rotate and why you should be rotating in the first place. Rotating is simply moving your players off of one site to another that the enemy is taking. There are 3 types of rotates: full rotate, player rotate, and an over rotation. A full rotation is when the attackers are 100% hitting a site and you need to rotate to help your team. The best way to full rotate is to first ask your team if they are committing to the site. If the answer is yes, or please help, rotate. Next up, we have a player rotate, which is pretty important. It's simply moving one player over to assist with extra pressure your team may be receiving at any given time. When one player rotates, another player needs to move to the position that he was just watching unless there is already somebody there. When this happens, you fill in the gaps. You basically move your defense power, stack it towards the presence, and spread it thin everywhere else. Usually in the areas that are the weakest, you'll have those players playing very passive in order to not die. Moving on to over rotation, you don't want to full rotate unless you're absolutely sure that the attackers are full on committing to a site. If you over rotate, you forfeit map control of the rest of the map. This means if the attackers are not committing, they can trickle into areas that you usually should have control of. This also means that attackers can have multiple forward positions and kill you if you have to rotate back to fill the positions that you gave up. So make sure you're not over-rotating, but don't refuse to rotate at all. It's a game in itself, definitely, but just use your communication and your microphone. If you're calming to your team, asking questions, and using your information utility wisely, you shouldn't have too much of an issue with over-rotation. Next, let's move on to retakes. Retaking is a very important part of the game. If your friends died on their site, you'll need to go and do a retake. This is where the spike is planted and you have less than 45 seconds to get onto site and defuse the spike. Retakes come down to a lot of factors: how quick your team is to rotate over, how many players are left from both sides, and how much utility is left for both teams. The list goes on. When you're retaking, you need to move as a unit and be ready to do it as a team. Do not go in one at a time. Flashing your way onto site, in combination with the Sova drone and Sova dart, is a great way to retake. Using smokes to cover chokes that you don't have control of are also great. You have to scale onto site as a unit in combination with utility, and it should be a quick, precise movement onto site. Generally, the enemy team is going to have a pretty solid idea of where you're coming from, so you aren't going to have to walk. If you are on a good flank though, use your sound bubble in the top left and run until you're in the area you suspect an enemy might be. Then you can start walking. Flanking is usually the only exception to when you should be walking, unless the enemy has no idea where you are. Also, clearing angles before the retake is pretty essential. You want to clear as many angles as possible before you start the retake, since you can spend a few seconds to check the angles you can see from your position or hold for a possible peek from the enemy. Once you're done clearing these angles, you can use informational utility and flashes to cover the rest of the angles, allowing for you to get onto site more effectively. So, by using all of this knowledge, if you remember the extremity control that we talked about earlier, use this to make one quick movement onto site, expelling your remaining utility and securing trade kills to trade out your teammates that may die. And remember, the clock is always ticking on retakes, so don't play stupid, but don't take too long either. And one last tip I'll throw in: as a last-ditch effort, and the enemy team is smoked off and spamming through the smoke as you defuse, body block or having a teammate stand in the way of your bullets can give you that extra second you need to defuse and win you rounds. Playing for retake is usually done if the player on site has no way of stopping the enemy push. be it they have no utility to stop it or they've lost a player. They can then proceed to leave site and play for retake. It can also be done if you don't want to risk losing a player in a weak area where your defenses are super thin. You can allow them to have that area and just play to get a good retake off using ultimates like a Breach ult or a Phoenix ult to gain ground fast. You'll mostly see players playing for retake on sites like B-Site Haven with ultimates like KJ ult or Breach ult, as they're great in assisting retakes. Also, I should note that instead of playing for retake, if the timer is super low in a round and they have to plant the spike and you are able to stop that, stop it. Next, we'll move on to fast retakes. Fast retakes are a decent play that you can make once or twice per game. This is a retake that happens almost immediately when you hear the spike getting planted. Once you hear the spike tapped, you've confirmed this is the site the attackers are playing for 100%. All of your players are ready outside, and you have a plan for all of your utility. Once the spike is getting planted, you barrage the enemy team with utility and retake as fast as possible, utilizing utility, trades, and aggression to steal the site back from them in an instant. This retake takes a lot of coordination and is generally done at the higher ranks, but it can be super effective if you're able to pull it off. Next, we'll talk about the spike game, as it's kind of a game in itself. It'll happen almost every game to some extent, and we'll take a 1v1 for example, but we're not going to dive too deep into it. Once you've retaken the site, you see where the spike is planted. This is not a surefire way of knowing where the last player is, but it is a decent indicator. It takes 7 seconds to defuse the spike and 3.5 seconds to half it. If you half it, the progress stays. There is an indicator for everyone to hear when the spike is tapped, and a higher pitched indicator when it's halved. I noticed at the higher ranks, players generally won't peek on first tap, almost ever. Take that info as you will, but I've gotten away with just sticking it on the first tap.
How we
Tower, you have a flash, you win this for sure.
Clutch.
No f***ing way. No way. What is he doing?
Last round in the half.
So generally, you can get at least half, and if you see the enemy shoulder, you don't have to get off the spike, and you can continue to at least get it to half. Tapping the spike can be a decent way to make the enemy reveal their location, but like I said earlier, sometimes they just won't peek. That's part of the mind games of it all. The more you play Valorant, the better you'll understand how to play the spike game. And we'll talk about the attacker perspective once we get into the attacker portion of the guide. Just know, the spike is a massive mind game in itself, and the only true way to get good at it is to understand how it's played and to have the experience of playing it a lot. So, understand that you shouldn't just sit there and tap over and over again, and understand that if you tap and make noise, they are not going to peek you as they know you're off the spike. And understand also that once you tap, and if you know they won't peek, and you have a pretty good idea of where they're at, you can kind of walk towards their position and hopefully kill them if you have enough time. Also, it's important to know that the enemy doesn't want to peek you. Some players are stupid though, and they will just peek you. But the goal is for them to waste your time. So feel free to try and stick, and don't get off every time right away if they shoulder you, as you'll just be playing right into their hands. Exit frags. These are when you know you cannot win the round, so you take the chance to kill the opponents when they're exiting the site in order to get a free gun or to break their economy so they lose some money. You can set up exit frags with teammates and hold crossfires and wait for the enemy team to try and leave the site. Saving is also when you know that the round is lost. For example, it's a 1v5 and you have an operator, it's best to try and save. Just know, if the enemy knows you have an operator, they will hunt you down oftentimes, so be ready and be in a position you can defend and fall off after you get one kill. Next, we're going to talk about our attacker side fundamentals. We're going to talk about defaulting first, and a default is something you're definitely going to want to understand. You'll use this the most on attack sides if your executes aren't working. So simply put, a default is spreading your forces on attack around every area of the map looking for picks. You're simply looking for defending players that overpeak and overextend. Players at almost every rank overpeak and give kills to attackers almost for free, so defaulting is just capitalizing on that. At the higher ranks, Immortal and Radiant, players still do this, but it'll be less common to get picks super often. So, when you're defaulting, you want to have every avenue covered in order to prevent the enemy team from gaining free forward positioning on you. On Haven, for example, on a mid-heavy default, you'll have 3 to 4 players watching middle, a trip watching A or C flank, and a player watching the other flank. If you are defaulting, you need to have these covered to prevent getting shot in the back. If you do not have any way to trip the flanks, you need to dedicate a player to watch that area while the rest of your team defaults. Aside from finding picks, you are also attempting to gain map control and contain the defenders into more claustrophobic positioning. Defaulting is a lot of poking, prodding, baiting utility, and gaining map control in certain areas. Your main goal is always as follows: finding picks, gaining map control, and determining where the defense is weakest. This will give you a good idea on where to attack. Baiting utility is another aspect to defaulting. If you're not able to find picks, you're going to want to bait out as much of the enemy team's utility as the round goes on. This makes the site execute a much easier prospect, as there will be a lot less utility to deal with when you decide to execute. You can easily bait out smokes, mollies, informational utility, or even break tripwires that the enemy may be playing off of. A good tip for utility baiting is showing presence heavily in one area and causing the defending side to react accordingly and waste smokes and mollies. The less utility the enemy team has when you decide to take a site, the more realistic it is for you to actually win against them. Information gathering is also quite important when defaulting, because gathering information on how the defenders are set up is important, as you can figure out who is playing where. Cypher could set up B on Ascent here, but next round move to the A site. So it's important to figure out where he's playing, as it'll help you make a decision on which site you'll want to hit when the time comes. Next, we're going to talk about zone control, as it goes hand in hand with defaulting. Since we're talking about Ascent, let's look at market control. Let's say the default goes as follows: Killjoy turret watching B main, 1 player holding A flank, and 3 players working a mid-heavy default. When the barriers drop, there is a smoke catwalk in top middle, as well as a Sova dart from your team to clear mid. Once it's clear, and let's say nobody has given you picks, you can work your way towards market using Sova drone or other clearing utility. Once you've gotten control of market, the defenders have all been offset in some type of way. The defending mid players are forced into CT spawn behind the smoke. There will probably be 2 players on B site, and that leaves 1 player on catwalk and 1 player on A. From here, you have a lot of map control to play with. You can split execute B, which we'll talk about a bit later, or you can break the door and head back towards A, hopefully causing more rotates. Once you have control of this zone though, the enemy team is going to be reeling and trying to stop you from taking sites, so they're most likely going to rotate a lot quicker if you indicate that you're heading towards B. So, this control is important simply because it denies the enemy from knowing your true intention, forcing them to burn even more utility, and it also gives you forward positioning if you decide to leave and go somewhere else, enabling a strong alert. Once you have this strong positioning, you have a lot more options basically, and if you end up getting a pick, the enemy team will be scared and will almost certainly over-rotate in some type of way. Once man advantage is gained from a pick, this is when you start to determine where the defense is weakest. Once you get a pick, it is super important to note that you do not have to go where you gained the pick. The defenders will have to fill in the positions to cover the leak in their defense that you just created with the pick. So please, take your time before just recklessly charging into a Cypher setup after killing their jet. Man advantage for the attackers is good, definitely, but just know that defenders still have most positions covered off of just one single pick. So instead of charging in, find their weak point and strike there. If you do not have man advantage on attackers, it's important to either reset into a default and try and find a pick, or execute if you're low on time. By resetting into default, you can spread out throughout the map and search for picks and hopefully rebalance the scales. In a 4 vs 4, the attackers are advantaged due to them being able to move together and have the potential to fight only one person. So, if you're down a player on attack, it's always smart to default and find a pick if you have the time to do it, or go for some zone control to press your defense and hopefully find a pick that way. Now, we're going to talk about executing, as it's an important concept, and you'll encounter and execute every single game. On attackers, it comes at the start of the round or at the end of your default. The main thing you need to know about executes is they need to be quick, precise, and with no hesitation. If you hesitate because of a smoke, your team becomes staggered, your entry fragger dies, and nobody trades them, and now you're down 1 to 2 players and are stuck behind a smoke with 0 map control. This is almost always a round loss. You also need to know if you execute at the start of the round, the enemy team has all of their utility, so don't be surprised if a molly comes in and shuts your push down. Push through the molly, push before the molly, or don't call for an execute at all if your team doesn't want to commit to it. An execute will generally look something like this: smokes into CT and market, a Sova drone coming out, a jet dashing to switch with the smoke, a flashbang after the jet, the rest of the team flooding site and trading each other as they go out. Just know that this is a perfect execute and something is almost always bound to go wrong, so you need to be quick to adjust while executing sight. Silver Dart comes in, shoot it. Cypher Trip hits your teammate, shoot it. Your teammate dies to somebody wide swinging through the smoke, trade them. There are a lot of variables in executes, and they're not always in your control. Communicate with your teammates, trade each other, break threatening utility, and secure the site. Sometimes, though, the enemy is set up and ready for your execute, and that's okay. Learn from that round loss and adjust the way you and your team are playing. So we're going to talk about entry fraggers, as it's an important role and usually falls on the duelist. But if your duelists are dead, it will always fall on the player with the least impactful utility. If your Brimstone, for example, has no utility and the rest of the duelists are dead, send them in first with the flash and get effective trades off. But in a world where duelists are doing their job in entry fragging, here's how it should be done and how the rest of the team should back them up. The entry fragger's main goal, first and foremost, is to create space for their team. Duelists with mobility are generally best at entry fragging, as they can gain a lot of space for free using a dash or blast packs. Plus, if the initiator is good, they can assist the entry fragger with a flash or dart to the area the duelist is speeding at. Entry fraggers cannot hesitate in their role. They speed onto site with confidence, and if they die, they need to come where they died from so that their teammate can trade them out. Once they have gained some space and are traded out, their goal is complete. Entry fraggers will not always get kills, which is perfectly fine. If the duelists at least gain ground onto site for the rest of their team to push out, they've done their job. I have an in-depth entry fragger guide, so I'll link that as well, so I'm not spending too much time on it. Every character has a position and an execute, so it's important to know. Generally, duelists will be the first in. Next comes the initiator, who will have used their utility to help the duelists get out. Then comes the controllers, who are assisting in trading duelists and initiator. Finally comes the sentinels, as their flank trip is fairly important while doing an execute. It's important to note also that any player that has expended all of their utility will generally get moved to the second position, as they don't have much value aside from just a weapon. Next up, we have split executes, which are also quite important. A split execute is simply having your forces split into two areas, rather than sending 5 through one choke. This is preferred, but can be tricky with poorly coordinated teams. Split executes need to be timed well, so that both sides are hitting at around the same time. Just spread your forces, one duelist for each side, and a player to help trade the duelists on the weaker side. Lurking is an important role, but not required. You also should not have a lurker every single round unless for some reason it is working every single round. Lurking is simply having one player not with your team pushing into the enemy lines once the defenders have rotated off that area. This role is best given to the player with the least amount of utility or somebody that's already set up in a decent position to lurk. This can be a super impactful play or a completely useless one depending on the timing of it. It's important you're not taking too long to the point your whole team dies, but it's important that you don't go too quick that the enemy hears you and kills you. The way to make a lurk work is simple. It's unpredictability. Lurking won't work if you do it every round because they're expecting you to do it. The first round you lurk, especially if it's effective, the enemy team will now be hyper aware of your lurking, so you can use that to your advantage. So rather than lurking again the next round, opt to not lurk. Wait a few rounds, and once they've forgotten about that play you made 4 rounds ago, do it again. This will cement that you're always lurking, and they will always be wary and worried about your presence. This is much more valuable than lurking every round and getting a kill every other round while you're doing it. Next, we're going to talk about spike plant positioning, as it definitely matters. There are optimal plant positions and default plant positions. Both are good for their own reason. Default plant positions are good for lineups, which are pieces of utility that your team always throws from far away to get the enemies off the spike. Defaults are good for lineups specifically, because most players that practice lineups know them for default positions. Optimal plant spots are good for opening up options for you to play at. Let's take Ace Site Haven for example. When planted default, it is only exposed to short and long. This makes it so any players that may be lurking or in heaven have no vision on the spike. This makes it so they have to sprint to the spike and will probably end up dying. But when you plant optimally, you in turn open up a lot of doors and avenues of approach for the players in heaven and CT. This is a major deterrent and will make the retaking team scared of all areas your team can be set up. So if you don't have lineups, plant optimally and maximize the amount of angles that the spike is visible to. Post plants are the scenario you're thrown into once you've secured the spike site and have the spike down. Now you've got to make a plan on how you'll hold the site from the retaking team. If you have any smokes, Now would be the time to use the rest of them to block off the chokes the enemy team will be trying to push from. It's best not to overpeak and give the enemy players free kills, as that's what they're looking for when they're retaking. It's important that you're also set up in a fashion where you're able to swing off of each other and trade each other out effectively. This makes it so you're not taking fights alone with no way to effectively trade each other. This should be a standard way that post plans are played. And remember, the retakers are fighting the clock, so the number one rule to consider is running down the timer as best as you can. Also note that you should be utilizing flash zones and flashes for yourself or your teammates if you do have to take fights. And towards the end of the post plant, mollies can knock a solid 5 to 8 seconds off the timer if you still have one, so toss it on the spike if the enemies get too close to it and you don't have lineups. Then continue to play time. One last thing to mention is take note of what the enemy team has remaining in terms of utility. If their controller player is still alive, it would not be wise to play an angle that can be smoked off. In Valorant, there are two types of weapons that are very hard for attackers to deal with: the operator and shotguns. We'll talk about both real quick. The operator, your main counter, is to first and foremost use informational utility and smokes. This is one of the main reasons flashes and initiators are so essential, as it really helps deal with oppressive operator players. Smoking off the operator will force them to either wait the smoke out or leave and rotate to a new position. Droning the op off or using a recon bolt to scan them will generally cause them to move. So it's important that you're using the utility available to clear these angles out. And remember, do not feed the operator. I've seen too many rounds fall apart due to players re-peeking into an angle the operator is holding. So, when all else fails and you have no other utility to clear, jump peek or shoulder peek to get the operator to shoot. This is not a surefire way to win against the operator, but it's better than just peeking them. Ops are oppressive, but they can be dealt with through the use of drones, flashes, smokes, and good movement. So please, do not give them free kills for no reason. Dealing with shotguns is similar, just don't subject yourself to tight corridors if you don't have to. Drones, flashes, etc., they all help a lot, but it's still a dangerous fight to take as shotguns are so strong in this game. Some areas you simply don't have to traverse through at all, but if you must, use your utility. You can even molly the angle out if it's possible. Don't just sprint in willy-nilly because you will lose. There are a lot of ways to position yourself in Valorant, and there's a lot of different ways to play angles. So first off, we have common angles. Let's take a look here at A-Site Ascent. The common angles here are Gen, Dice, Switch, Heaven, and Hell. They're common angles because they're so strong. They're angles with a lot of fallback potential and cover, and they're commonly played. Of course, obviously, it's in the name. So, the strength of these angles is why they're played so much, and why you'll see players at them so often. Off angles are angles that generally aren't pre-aimed, as they're awkward and usually dangerous and don't come with much cover. These angles are very strong though, since players won't expect them to be played. The chances of them being pre-aimed are very small. This is a good example of an off angle here. As you can easily see, it's quite a dangerous position, as once you take a fight, there's not a great way to get behind cover quickly in case you're swung or you want to abandon the fight. This is where escapability utility plays a big role. One and done angles are just angles that you'll generally only get one kill from before dying, as you have no escape route, and they're played to take enemy players by surprise or to take advantage of weapons that may excel in these positions. One and done angles can be super strong positions with the crossfire, but they're quite risky positions, even with escapability, since they're so far from any cover. So play these positions sparingly and play them with a plan in mind, be it having a teammate play off of you or to run into the A main smoke after getting one, etc. Overpeaking is mainly an issue that defending players deal with a lot. Overpeaking is peeking into multiple players or assuming you'll win a 1v1 with an enemy player only to lose and lose your man advantage. Now, especially when you don't have man advantage, please don't peek into the attackers and give them free kills that they're so desperately looking for. If you plan to peek into the enemies, have some sort of plan before doing so. Have a teammate draw their attention or flash for you, and don't just wide swing into the enemy's area expecting to get 3 free kills. If you have an operator, sure, you can post at the start of the round, but once you get one, it may be a better idea to play a fallback angle rather than continuing to fight from the same angle that you were just spotted at. That's another important thing to note. Once you're spotted at an angle, if your team isn't actively fighting, do not re-peek for no reason. You'll just be giving the enemy a free kill 9 times out of 10. Finally, last on our list, we have angle isolation. Angle isolation is super important. It's basically just making sure you're only exposing yourself to one dangerous angle at a time. You don't want to peek top mid like this, since you'll be exposing yourself to tiles. Isolate the angle and make it so you can only fight one person at a time, and you can only be swung from one person at a time. This applies to almost every fight you take in Valorant and every angle in the game. It's an important concept to internalize, and you obviously won't always be able to only be exposed to one at a time, but try and minimize the amount of angles you're exposed to in general. This is a great rule of thumb to play by. Angle merging is an important concept that not a lot of players do. Angle merging is simply creating one angle from two angles. Instead of holding tiles far up like this, you can fall back into cat and watch both catwalk and tiles at the same time. You can apply this to numerous angles in the game, so if you ever find yourself trying to hold two angles, just fall back a bit and turn it into one angle. Teamplay is important in Valorant, and effectively playing off your team is a great concept to understand. So first off, let's talk about proper trading, as we've touched on it a bit earlier. You want to be able to be positioned with a teammate close enough to be able to trade them if they end up dying at any specific moment. Sometimes trades can't happen due to your teammate dying in an untradeable position. It's important that when you're playing Valorant, you try your best to die in tradable positions and play off of your teammates and get the trade if they die in a decent spot. This doesn't mean use your teammate as bait for a free kill, but play off of them and be ready to trade at any given moment to rebalance the scale. So you can set these baits up, and it's pretty cool and important to understand how to do it. If you have a teammate in a one and done position, or just a position that is a bit awkward, draw the opponent's attention away from them. Do everything in your power to not let that enemy know your teammate is in that position. This will enable your teammate to have a lot of impact from said position. Break utility for them, draw attention for them, and then once the enemy team eventually crosses their path, peek off of them. Peek off me is a phrase you'll hear thrown out a lot when you're playing. It's basically just your teammate telling you to tuck and not fight until they fight. So once they fight an enemy, swing to assist them. You can also relay this to your teammate, and they should hopefully know what you're trying to tell them. Setting up crossfires is also very important, and we've shown it off a bit earlier, so I'm just going to put this here as a reminder. You can make crossfires out of almost every angle, as long as you and your teammate are not exposing yourselves and there is one angle actively being watched. You can turn it into a crossfire very effectively. The last thing we have is utility combination, as there are hundreds of ways to combine utility in this game, but we're just going to talk about a couple of them. A well-placed vulnerable can turn Sova's Hunter's Fury into a one-shot ability rather than it taking two shots. A Fade Tether and Raise Nade off the start of the round can counter any attackers or defenders from going for a quick peek. An Omen blinding with a Jet dashing into the angle Omen blinded can create for some great aggressive plays. Just get creative with it, because there's hundreds of ways to combine utility effectively, and you'll learn a lot as you go. So just make sure you're thinking about the possibilities while you're playing. Moving on to one of our biggest topics, we have Gunplay. Gunplay in Valorant is a lot simpler than games like Counter-Strike, as there's no set recoil pattern. But there is some skill to it that has to be understood to use these weapons effectively. You become inaccurate when you move and shoot, so you have to stand still in order to be the most precise. Counter-strafing is a bit useless in this game, so we're going to throw that out the window for now and opt for a better way to teach new players how to move and shoot properly. Using this movement error crosshair here, we can see when we're fully accurate. If you're a new player, this could be helpful to enable in your crosshair settings. So, while moving, the crosshair expands, showing us we're inaccurate. But when we stop moving by letting go of either strafe key, we become very accurate very quickly. So strafe, stop, and shoot. If you want to take this a step further, you can enable the shooting error graph in your settings. This will tell you on your screen when you're accurate. You're going to want to remember that principle if you want to get anywhere in this game. So practice this in the range and in deathmatch, and you'll become familiar with movement and accuracy and how to properly strafe in no time. You can incorporate counter-strafing instead of letting go of the key, and this is when you're hitting the opposite strafe key and shooting in the dead zone. This will enable you to quickly move directions back and forth while maintaining accuracy by shooting when your movement zeroes out in between directional changes. Can't stress this enough, but strafing is essential if you want to become a good player. You must be able to move effectively during gunfights to throw off the opponent and make yourself a harder target to hit. This also means that you should avoid dropping and crouch spraying as much as possible, as it makes you an extremely easy target for even the worst players to hit. So learn how to properly strafe, and it'll benefit you greatly in the long run. Tapping, when combined with strafing, is insanely effective at mid to long range duels. Shooting in small increments with your Vandal will help you stay consistently accurate throughout your gunfight. This is best when the enemy is pretty far away and you cannot rely on bursting or spraying. It's important that you're not panicking while tapping. Just take your time, breathe, and line up shot after shot onto the opponent's head. I'll talk about practicing each of these mechanics later, but for now, I just want to explain them to you. Bursting is great for medium to long range as well, as you're shooting a burst of 3 to 4 shots at the opponent, strafing to the side, then bursting again. This will help you in those duels that you don't think you'll be able to tap effectively or get a few more shots off quicker. This is one of the best ways to stay mobile and put as many shots downrange as possible in a short amount of time. Spraying is best for dealing with multiple opponents, moving opponents, and for mid to close range when you don't feel confident in your bursting or tapping. Spraying is also quite inconsistent in this game, unfortunately, as there's no set pattern to it. The easiest way to learn how to spray is to watch the muzzle of your weapon, and whichever way you start to see it sway, adjust to the other direction. For our last concept of gunplay, we have to talk about spamming. Spamming is important when you have a general idea of where the enemy player is, or you have to spray at the spike. It's simply just spraying through walls or smokes. You can spam with bursts and taps also, but spraying is the main way of spamming. If you have a suppressor, you are safe to spam from the same angle, for the most part. But if you are using an unsuppressed weapon, make sure you're moving after every sequence of bursting or spraying so the enemy doesn't see your tracers and kill you right away through the smoke. Before we get into practicing gunplay, I want to talk about mechanical skill, and we'll tie it all together at the end of the section. Crosshair placement, if you haven't heard of it by some miracle, is keeping your crosshair at head level. But why? Well, in Valorant, keeping your crosshair at head level allows you to dispatch of enemies quicker, as you'll be closer to their head. It also means that you have to make a much smaller adjustment to actually line yourself up to the opponent's head. The smaller the adjustment, the better. No matter how good you are at aiming, you want to minimize the amount of movements you physically have to make, enabling your aiming precision to do the rest for you. This means you should always be aware of where exactly head level is and have your crosshair trained at head level at almost all times. The way you can get better at this is by playing and keeping this in mind the entire time. When you died and your crosshair placement was off, note by how much. Crosshair placement also impacts how you hold angles. You don't want to place your crosshair super close to angles, as you'll have no way to actually react if an enemy crosses your crosshair. Instead, offset your crosshair from the angle just a bit to give yourself some time to react to the enemy player. If you know that the enemy is walking and will walk into your crosshair, then you can hold closer to the angle. But if you suspect the enemy will sprint across your screen, hold a bit wider. The more you play, the better feel for this you'll get. But it's important that when you start off, you're always keeping the concept of crosshair placement in mind. Pre-aiming. Pre-aiming is just as important as crosshair placement, and it follows the same principles to an extent. Pre-aiming is lining your crosshair up to common angles through walls before you actually peek them. When you start off, you won't be able to do this very well, but the more you play, the better you'll be able to understand common angles and where they are relative to you. So make sure you're remembering this aspect, as it's very important. It follows the same path of being important due to the fact that if you are pre-aimed on common angles, sometimes you won't even have to move your crosshair for an easy kill. You want to move through the map clearing angles effectively by using pre-aiming, but there's one thing to keep in mind with this, and it's where your mouse is positioned. While clearing and pre-aiming angles, you'll find that you run out of mousepad space eventually. This means that you need to reset your mouse back to its strongest position before peeking the next angle. The strongest angle is defined as the position on your mousepad where you feel the most natural and strongest. When aiming, you will stray from this position over time. Everyone has a strongest position, and if you're not used to the mouse, you will develop one over time. But it's generally just the most natural position on your mousepad. The importance of resetting your mouse position to the strongest position is for 2 reasons. 1, you'll be able to mentally prepare before you actually take the swing, which is super important. And 2, you'll be at a position where adjustments will feel the most natural. You don't want to peek into an enemy unprepared and then have to adjust while your mouse is turned sideways from clearing angles. Flicking is the flashiest of the subsets of mechanical skill, easily. It's one quick and precise adjustment to the target. Flicks can be broken up into 2 adjustments. Macro flicking is a large adjustment where you're taking a linear path to the target. You will generally not be on target after a macro flick. The second portion is the micro flick. This is a small, precise adjustment to the enemy's head and usually follows after a macro flick. Macro and micro flicks can exist without each other, but generally, you'll see the 2 working in tandem to help you aim. Flicks are important, but are more of a last resort for when your pre-aiming and crosshair placement doesn't work out, or when an enemy takes you by surprise. Flicking is flashy, but you don't want all of your adjustments to be flicks. That would be insane. So next, let's move on to target swapping, as it's the ability to move quickly from one target to another. A good example of this is when you're shooting an opponent and another swings, forcing you to quickly adjust after getting the first kill. Target swapping is important because there are a lot of instances where you'll have to quickly shoot one target, then quickly shoot the next. Next on our list, we have tracking, which is the ability to keep your crosshair on a moving target. This is important for when you are spraying at, let's say, a raise saturating through the air, or maybe you have to quickly shoot a gecko's thrash as it's speeding towards you. Basically, all I'm saying is tracking is important in Valorant and a lot of players tend to neglect it. Just because it's an uncommon thing for you to use doesn't mean you shouldn't practice it. The more rounded each of these subsets of mechanical skill are, the better you are as a mechanically skilled player. You're only as strong as your weakest link. Always remember this. Next up, we have movement, since it's very important when it comes to your mechanical skill. Being able to navigate the map efficiently is important to any player. Movement takes some time to get used to in this game, so just know when you're mid-air, holding A and D and looking in that direction will speed you towards that direction quickly. Also know that crouch jumping and strafing will help you get to angles that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. Combining movement with strong mechanical skill is a must if you want to hit Radiant. So make sure you're strafing unpredictable while bursting and tapping away, and make sure you're moving yourself out of danger whenever it presents itself. So, if we want to put them all together in a nice package, crosshair placement and pre-aiming complement each other. They also make it so the other subsets, flicking, tracking, and target swapping, have to do a lot less work in order to be effective. Mouse placement in the strongest position will always help you pre-aim better and more effectively, which is an added bonus. This is obviously just a summary. If you want a more in-depth guide, I went into crazy detail over on SkillCap's channel with a guide I wrote for them, so check it out. It's pretty good. There are a few types of ways to peek angles in Valorant. Let's talk about the main ones real quick. So we have the standard peek, which is simply pre-aiming, holding a strafe key, walking into an angle, stopping, and shooting. This peek is good, and it's pretty standard, and it's what you use the most when you're taking an engagement. The wide swing is when you suspect an enemy may be ready for your standard peek. It's also good for players that are holding close angles. The wide swing is good because you're covering a large distance across their screen in a quick time frame. Generally, it's best against players holding close. Reason being is the closer they are to you, the faster you move across their screen. So this is a great way to counter those types of players. The shoulder peek is used generally when you suspect the enemy is using the operator. This can be used to bait out a shot, and once you bait out the shot, you can post on the angle and challenge the operator or decide to leave. It can also be used to force the enemy player's crosshair closer to the angle, and then you can follow it up with a wide swing. You want to be up against a wall and show only your shoulder. You won't be able to see the angle you're peeking, but you will be showing a little bit of shoulder off to the enemy watching the angle. The info peek is used to gather information. You generally won't be able to get shots off on an info peek, as its primary use is to see if there's an enemy playing in an angle that you suspect. This can be used to make a decision to pre-aim and swing into the angle, or to get a teammate to help you. The jiggle peek is where you're exposing just enough of yourself to be able to strafe into the angle, take a burst, and then unpeek right away. This is mainly used to fight players holding an angle on you. Next up, we have the jump peek, which is a quicker and sometimes safer info peek. You can perform this by jumping into an angle and then strafing out of the enemy's vision by using your A and D key while looking to the left or right. Generally, this is used for information, so make sure you actually gather information when you perform this peek. You can also hold crouch while jumping to peek over a box and get information that way. Next, I'm going to show you how you can properly peek angles super quick and how you can practice proper peeking. While you're in-game, I noticed that lower ranks tend to walk around with their crosshair at head level, but instead of properly peeking common angles, they just set their crosshair at head level and call it good, and they don't incorporate the pre-aiming mechanic and tend to adjust their crosshair afterwards, or not at all. This is bad because if you walk around without pre-aiming common angles, you will get killed a lot. So instead of walking around like this, walk till you get to a common angle, stop, pre-aim, silent peek, rinse and repeat, and clear your angles like this. So pre-aim all of the angles that players could potentially be playing, and you'll be ahead of 99% of the players. Before we talk about improving yourself mechanically, we first must talk about how to find the sensitivity you'll use on your improvement journey. You don't want a super fast sensitivity where you're constantly over flicking to targets, and you don't want a sensitivity too slow where you have to lift your mouse up 10 times in one movement. Find a decent middle ground, pick it, and monitor the issues you're having. My sensitivity is 0.43 at 800 DPI, which is considered to be on the higher end of the spectrum. But you'll find yours easily by monitoring your common mistakes. If you find yourself flicking, but flicking past the opponent even by just a little, super often, try dropping your sensitivity just a tad. If you find yourself flicking, but almost never making the mark and shooting before you reach the opponent, try increasing it just a bit. For an added note, generally, duelists and aggressive players will sometimes have a higher sensitivity to enable them to swap targets more efficiently. So playstyle will play a role in how high of a sensitivity you want, but it's not a determining factor. If you really want to hammer out your sensitivity, you can use the aiming routine I'll show off a bit later to help you determine if your sensitivity is too high or too low. Next, we have finding your crosshair, and I don't think it's as important as people tend to change their crosshair pretty often. It was generally accepted as fact in CS, the game I played before, that changing your crosshair is bad because it messes with your muscle memory. This is in fact kind of wrong. Muscle memory plays a very small role in mechanical skill, so adjusting crosshair and sensitivity is honestly fine. I just would advise not to overdo it and change it every single day. Finding your crosshair is simple. Just pick whatever you're able to easily pick apart from the background of your screen and doesn't obstruct your vision too much where you can't shoot targets at a distance. As an added note, you can change your crosshair color in-game, which helps. If you're playing Viper, you can switch to pink, which allows you to pick your crosshair out super easily in her ultimate. I find myself switching my crosshair from green to red if I'm playing against a Viper, and from red or pink to green if I'm playing against an Astra. This can be super helpful in games where ability colors tend to make your crosshair blend in. Practice makes permanent, and it's important on your improvement path. So let's talk about mechanical improvement and give some pointers. If you're new to using a mouse for shooters, aim trainers are phenomenal. They can help you get used to handling the mouse and can put you in a lot of scenarios much quicker than Valorant can. If you're pretty good at using a mouse already, in-game practice will be your best friend. Obviously, you can use both, just know that each have their separate benefits. For sake of today's video, which I've spent like 20 hours writing so far, so I assume will be pretty long, we're just going to talk about training in-game. So, for in-game training, we're offered a few options: the range, deathmatch, and team deathmatch. Each have their own benefits. In the range, I'm going to give you a quick practice routine that you can apply right now to help you iron out kinks and help you become a rock-solid aimer. We're going to break down one of the most simple aiming routines that will help you hit every major aiming facet. You obviously can change the amount of time that you use for these exercises to suit yourself better, and you can even choose different routines. This is just the one I've been recommending to people since beta. The first exercise we have is tracking. You're going to want to place your crosshair on the head of an opponent. From there, you're going to want to strafe left and right, while keeping your crosshair trained on the head of a bot. Do this for 2 minutes. This will help you practice your tracking and get your arm and wrist moved up for the rest of today's exercises. This exercise will help a lot with determining if your sensitivity is too high or too low, as you either won't be able to keep up with the head if it's too slow, or you won't be able to stay on target at all and you're stuttering super hard if it's too high. Make sure while you're doing this exercise, you're changing the distance from you to the bot. The second exercise we have is slow aiming. Slowly aim from one bot to the next, taking your time with each tap. This will help you become familiar with the distance you have to move your mouse across the mousepad while aiming. Do this exercise for 3 minutes. The third exercise we have is target swapping. Shoot one target, then quickly adjust to the next. Make sure you're prioritizing accuracy over speed here. You can do this with bursts and taps, or you can simply do it while spraying. The fourth exercise is for micro flicking practice. You want to place your crosshair offset from the bot's head. Quickly adjust to hit the head with a burst or a tap. Make sure that you prioritize accuracy over speed in this exercise. If you're missing consistently, slow it down. The more you practice this exercise, the quicker you'll become. But you need to focus first and foremost on being accurate and precise with your flicks. Then you can incorporate speed. Do this exercise for 3 minutes. The fifth exercise we have is jiggle tapping. This will help you familiarize yourself with pre-aiming angles and quickly peeking in and out of angles. This exercise is super important to learn solid peeking fundamentals. You can do this for about 3 minutes also. You can rinse and repeat this routine as much as you want. Tweak the timings to suit your weak areas, or you can add in new exercises entirely. And just remember, this is a very basic aiming routine that I crafted up a few years ago, so there's a lot of newer information out there for people that have been aim practicing for a while. So if you're experienced with aiming or want to incorporate more, there's plenty of guides out there to help you get started with complex aiming drills. But for a beginner, this is more than enough to skyrocket you from lower ranks to ascendant level at the very least. And if you're curious how long you should practice, honestly, it's whatever you're comfortable with. Don't practice for any more than an hour though if you're just starting off, especially if you're new to using a mouse. You're working muscles that you've never worked before, and you can actually injure your wrist or hand from practicing too hard. I made that mistake when I was practicing in CSGO, and I had to take a 2-week-long break while I waited for my wrist to recover. So, next, we're going to talk about how you can apply deathmatch to your practice. Deathmatching is a tool. You can play it to win, I guess, if you're a loser. But if you want to really see improvement, don't just zone out and shoot heads. Don't sit in corners and try and win. Make a conscious effort towards improvement while playing deathmatch. You should always be practicing pre-aiming in deathmatches. It'll help you get used to peeking properly. Do this and add in one gunplay mechanic that you really want to work on, be it bursting, tapping, or spraying, and do that for the entirety of the deathmatch. Your deathmatches should always have one mechanic that you're focusing on for said deathmatch. That's all you need to do when you're playing DM. Do not overthink it. Just peek properly and have a gunplay mechanic that you've chose to practice on. Warming up and practicing are two completely different things that people tend to get confused. Warming up is simply hopping on, playing a couple of deathmatches, and getting your arm, wrist, and mind ready to play the game. Practice is when you're going out of your way and picking a few mechanics to work on and putting forth a real effort to work on them via the use of aim trainers, the range, or multiple deathmatches. Warming up happens before games. Practice comes after you're done playing or before you go to bed. There are studies done that show practicing skills before you sleep helps you internalize them better. So that's going to be the optimal time for you to be practicing or watching over your gameplay footage. And remember, professional sports players do a quick warm-up before playing in official matches. They don't do hard practice, and you shouldn't either. So in terms of generalized improvement to your raw game sense and just yourself as a player outside of mechanics, there's a few ways you can improve. Playing with a purpose is our first concept that I really want to hammer home for generalized improvement. A lot of players tend to just hop on Valorant, play a few matches, and get off thinking that they work their way towards improving. And yes, you will improve by simply playing the game, but if you play with a real purpose, you will improve exponentially faster. If you are brand new to the game, just play. But when you start learning the game a bit better, you're gonna want to start playing with more purpose in order to actually improve at a quick rate. So, when you hop on the game, always pick something that you want to work on outside of mechanics. This can be focusing on becoming better at setting up bait plays or directing your team in defaults, etc. This brings us to our next point, thinking while you're playing, which sounds simple, but a lot of players don't do it for some reason. Think about the game you're playing, the team composition the enemy has, the team comp you have, and the possibilities that they both have. Monitor the enemy's ultimate abilities and your abilities, and think about what is possible at any given time. For example, if the enemy has breach ult, it could be a good indicator that they're setting up for an A execute or a B execute or vice versa, something quick with the breach ult. Just think about these things when you're playing. If you're attacking, note where the defenders play each round so you can better understand the way they're reacting to your team's playstyle. If you're defending, think consciously about why you're doing what you're doing and how it's benefiting your team. Think about if there's anything more you could be doing for your team other than just sitting backside with a teammate while they're pressuring mid. Just think. Think about the actions you do, why you're doing them, and this will open up a lot of doors for you and help you improve as a player so that things can become more natural and fluent for you as you play. You also need to analyze your mistake. You died peeking tiles at the start of the round. What exactly were you trying to accomplish? You peeked simply to get a kill and you failed, and now it's a 4v5. What could you have done differently? It's a 2v2, and you decide to peek for info and get toasted, and now your teammate is trying to win a 1v2 and you lose the round. Or you decide to leave mid on ascent to rotate to B because there was presence there, and an enemy walked through spawn and killed your A rotators. These are all super simple mistakes that even players in Immortal and Radiant make all the time. So you're surely going to make them too as you play. Make sure that once you die, you understand why it is you died, because it's not always as simple as I lost my fight. Majority of the times, there are things you could have done differently. Just know, this doesn't mean every death is in your control. Sometimes things just happen that you can't really control, and you have to be okay with that. Some games, you're just going to play horribly. That's perfectly fine. And for another super important point, we have the issue of autopiloting. I still struggle with this, and I've been playing TAC FPS games for over a decade. I think every single player will have this issue to an extent. Autopiloting is simply going through the motions while you're playing. You kind of just zone out and stop thinking. This is bad for a variety of reasons, obviously, but the main one is that you aren't improving at all when you autopilot. You stop thinking about the game, so in turn, you're not thinking about your personal play at all. You keep making stupidly simple mistakes that you straight up wouldn't have made if you were just consciously thinking while playing, rather than zoning out and thinking about something else. I've made this analogy 100 times in my videos since I heard it from, I think, like Steel in like 2015 or something. When you're driving to work or to school in your car, you enter autopilot where you just stop thinking about things and end up at your destination as if you traveled through time. This analogy is great because the more you play Valorant or competitive games in general, the more prevalent this issue truly becomes. So try your best to recognize when you're autopiloting and snap out of it to get your head back into the game as soon as possible. Finally, we have VOD reviewing. You shouldn't have to pay for coaching, honestly. There's plenty of free videos out there that can give you some good direction on improvement and learning the game. By VOD reviewing, you're essentially cutting out the coach and becoming your own. When you watch your own gameplay footage back, mistakes become a lot more obvious. You'll see mistakes and things you should have done differently from a brand new perspective. Record a couple of your matches, watch them back, and take some notes on your common mistakes. It's honestly really simple and is something all new players should try a few times to help them better understand their playstyle and their common mistakes. If you're VOD reviewing, once again, you're ahead of like 99% of players that just refuse to do it. Next up, we have Plateaus and Slumps. Everyone is going to encounter these at some point in their competitive FPS journey. A plateau is just when you feel as though you aren't improving at all and have stagnated. A slump is when you're performing way worse than usual for a long time period. The answer to both of these is actually pretty similar, so I'm going to explain both here. Sometimes it's just that you've been playing the game too much and you just need an extended break to come back feeling fresh. Sometimes it's because you need to reapproach the way you're thinking about the game, so if you take a break and you're still having issues, reapproach the game from a new perspective. It can also come down to over-practicing or not practicing enough, so if you never practice, give it a try. If you practice for an hour a day, try toning it down a bit and focus more on consciously playing Valorant or just VOD reviewing. A common trend I've noticed from my CS teammates or Radiant friends is they tend to change their settings over and over if they're in a slump. They'll briefly get out of the slump because they changed their settings, only to fall into another slump or plateau shortly after. This is because changing your settings is more of a temporary fix. It's like a band-aid. Everything feels new and different, so it makes them consciously think about aiming and moving and doing things in the game. So, if you're changing your settings and it's working to break you out of slumps and plateaus, but you end up falling right back into them, you've successfully found your issue. You're not thinking while playing. I know, I keep hammering this idea home, but I'm doing so because it's super important. A VOD reviewing can also help exponentially to help you break out of plateaus and slumps. And for our final topic for today's insanely long video is settings. And since this is a beginner guide, I thought I'd go over it real quick. So, first off, you should disable corpses as it decreases the clutter on your screen. This one is personal preference, of course. I play with bodies on, but it's generally recommended to have them turned off. Secondly, let's turn on blood, as it'll help indicate when you're hitting people behind tall barriers. It'll also help indicate when you're hitting people in general. Next, let's turn on raw input buffer, please, because this is extremely important to decrease input delay, as it directly routes your inputs from your mouse to your game, making for a much smoother experience. You should also be disabling scrolling through weapons with mouse wheel, as it's much quicker and more efficient to just press 1, 2, or 3 to switch between your weapons. From here, if you want to bunny hop easier, you can bind your jump to mouse wheel down. It's a bit weird at first, but once you get used to it, you'll literally never go back. At least give it a chance before writing it off. For minimap, it's just whatever you most prefer. I prefer to have it rotate with me and to keep players centered so I can gain info quickest. The most important thing about the minimap is you want to be able to gather as much information as quick as possible in as little time as possible, so just make it suit you to the best of your ability. Next, let's enable NVIDIA On Plus Boost. This is good for reducing input delay on NVIDIA graphics cards. And next up, we have another essential here. For auto-equip priority, set this to strongest. Enable Don't Auto-Equip Melee, and this will make it so after throwing out your utility, you're pulling out your weapon instead of your knife. This is extremely important. For graphics, just set them all to low, honestly. It'll help your FPS and it'll decrease a lot of clutter, making it easier to see enemies. If you want less input lag, go to your desktop, right-click Valorant, and select Properties. From here, enable Run as Admin and disable full screen optimization. Next, press your Windows key, type in mouse settings, click additional mouse options, pointer options, and disable enhanced pointer precision. This is a built-in mouse acceleration. Turn this off. For general keybinds, I recommend changing the abilities to whatever you're comfortable with. I changed most of mine from default and moved my ultimate key to a key I wouldn't fat finger as I had an issue popping my ult randomly. If you want a more vibrant game, you should consider turning on digital vibrance in your NVIDIA control panel. Right-click on your desktop, go to NVIDIA control panel, adjust desktop color settings, and play around with the value here. I personally use 100%, but you can use whatever you want. This is monitor specific, by the way. Well, all right, I think that brings us to the end of today's video. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you're here to this point, I appreciate you guys for watching, and I hope you actually did learn a lot. I did my best to compile as much information as possible, but with making a project this big, I feel like I missed a lot of like minor things, and I may have gotten a little bit messy in the middle in some areas. So I apologize if there was like a lack of some information you guys wanted in here, but I tried to compile as much basic information into this as possible so that anyone that was new to the game could just kind of have this big, massive video that they could go to, and they could kind of just save, and then they could come back to it when they need it or want something explained to them. So that's kind of what this video was like. Main purpose was just a big video that explains a big overarching theme of Valorant and explains a lot of the core concepts that a lot of new players are going to struggle with when they first come to this game. So that was my complete goal on this. If I, accomplish this goal for any of you guys, please let me know in the comments. A lot of time went into this video, so I do hope you guys enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. But with that being said, though, after I get home in 3 weeks, a month, however long it's going to take me to get home, I am going to start streaming again on Twitch. I just wanted to get this video done. I've been working on this for a couple weeks, so hopefully I can get it done, uploaded, and then come home in a few weeks and I can start streaming again for you guys. But I appreciate you guys for sticking around, and I will see you in the next video, whatever I decide to do. All right, see you.